The morning my brother walked into my office, I was in the middle of a call with our biggest client. Not a small client. Not a "we'd like to expand our contract" client. I'm talking about Ashford Financial, a regional wealth management firm with over 400 employees. And they were about to sign a 12-month retainer that would have been the single largest contract in the 3-year history of my company. My hands-free headset was in, my laptop was open, and I had 3 tabs running with the proposal, the pricing sheet, and the drafted agreement all pulled up simultaneously. My assistant knocked twice, which was our signal for urgent but not a fire. I held up one finger without turning around. She knocked again. I turned around, and there he was, my brother. Standing in my doorway in a blazer he'd clearly just bought. You could still see the crease lines from the packaging, with my mother right behind him and my father one step back. All 3 of them in my office on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, uninvited, looking around at the space I had built like they were evaluating a property they already owned. I told the client I'd call him back in 20 minutes. He was gracious about it. I closed my laptop, took out my headset, set it on the desk. And I waited. My brother. I'll call him by what he is, which is the person my parents poured every resource they had into for 32 years. Smiled at me with the particular confidence of someone who has never once had to earn anything. "Nice setup," he said. "We need to talk about the future of this company." I didn't say anything. He sat down across from my desk without being invited to. My mother settled into the chair near the window. My father stayed standing near the door with his arms crossed, which was always his way of reminding me that he could leave at any moment, that his time was valuable, that I should feel grateful he was present at all. "We've been thinking," my brother said, "and we think it makes sense for me to come on board as a co-founder. My name on the company, equal equity split, and I'll take over the client relationship side." I looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have a background in client relations," I said. "I have people skills." "This isn't about people skills. This requires industry knowledge, contract law, financial compliance. That's why you hire people," he said, and waved his hand like I had just described the kind of inconvenience that other people dealt with. "I want to explain who my brother is so you understand what was happening in that room. He graduated from college 6 years ago with a communications degree he barely finished. In those 6 years, he had worked 4 jobs, none of which lasted longer than 14 months, and was currently, as far as I knew, consulting, which meant he was living in my parents' house in Phoenix and spending their money while he figured out his next move. He had no savings. He had no clients. He had once told me at a Christmas dinner 3 years prior that my company was cute, but that I should think about whether I really wanted to be managing people long-term because it seemed stressful. I had started my company, a boutique compliance consulting firm for mid-sized financial institutions. At 27, with $11,000 I had saved over 4 years of working as a junior analyst. I had no co-founders, no investors, no family money. My parents had offered to help my brother with a down payment on a condo the year I started my business, and when I had asked whether they might contribute anything to my startup costs, my father had said, "That's different. Real estate is an investment. A business is a gamble." I had not asked again. By the time my brother walked into my office, I had 8 full-time employees, 2 contractors, and a client roster of 23 firms across Arizona, Nevada, and Texas. I had done that in 36 months. I was 30 years old. "I appreciate you coming in," I said. "But the answer is no. I'm not restructuring ownership." My mother's expression shifted. That particular shift, the one where her face goes from pleasant to wounded, was one I had been watching my entire life. It meant that something was about to become about her. "We're not asking you to give us anything," she said. "This is about family building something together. Don't you want that?" "I have already built something. It's mine." "Everything doesn't have to be yours," my father said from the doorway. "That's a very lonely way to live." This was the thing about my family. They had a way of framing every conversation about what they wanted from me as a lesson about my character. My refusal to hand over equity in a company I had built alone was evidence that I was lonely. My preference for boundaries was evidence that I was cold. My success, somehow, was always just slightly suspicious, like it meant I had prioritized the wrong things. I had grown up understanding that in our family, my brother was the investment, and I was the outcome that didn't require planning. He was enrolled in every program, coached for every opportunity, funded for every endeavor. I was expected to figure things out and be grateful that nobody was in my way. And I had figured things out. That was the part they hadn't anticipated. I need to get back to my client, I said. We're not done, my brother said. I am. They left. My father made a comment on his way out about how I'd always had trouble seeing the bigger picture. My mother said she hoped I would think about what really mattered. My brother said nothing but paused at the door and looked back at me in a way that I recognized. The look of someone recalibrating, not retreating. I called my client back. We closed the Ashford financial contract 40 minutes later. I didn't hear from my family for 3 weeks after that. Then my brother called. He was apologetic in that specific way that people who have never genuinely apologized learn to imitate. The words were right, the tone was wrong, and there was always a but about halfway through. I think we got off on the wrong foot, he said. I wasn't trying to push you out or anything. I just think there's real potential there and I want to be involved. Involved how? I asked. I've been talking to some people, he said, people who know the compliance space. And there's a lot of room to grow if you had someone handling the business development side while you focused on the technical work. I handle both, I said. I know, but I handle both, I said again, and I'm good at it. There was a pause. Look, he said. I'm just saying having a man in a visible leadership role might open some doors for you that. I hung up. I'm not proud of hanging up without responding, but I also know that if I had stayed on the line, I would have said something I couldn't take back, and I needed to stay clear-headed. There was something in what he said. Not the content, which was insulting on multiple levels, but the phrasing, I've been talking to some people, that stayed with me. My brother did not know people in the compliance space. He had never expressed any interest in financial services in his life. The fact that he had done any research at all, spoken to anyone at all, meant that whatever this was, it wasn't a casual idea. Someone had been working on this. I started paying attention. Over the next 2 months, I noticed things. Small things individually, significant things together. A longtime contact at one of my mid-tier clients, a regional bank in Tucson, mentioned in passing that he had gotten a call from someone asking about my firm's stability. He hadn't thought much of it. I asked who called. He didn't know the name. One of my contractors, a woman I had worked with since my second year in business, mentioned that she had been approached about joining a new venture in the compliance space by someone she didn't know who had reached out on LinkedIn. The venture was vague. The money being offered was specific and higher than what I was paying her. A potential client I had been cultivating for 4 months went quiet after a meeting that had gone, in my assessment, very well. I followed up. They said they were reevaluating their options. No further explanation. None of these things were definitive. But I had built a business on pattern recognition, on looking at disparate data points and understanding what they were pointing toward before anyone else saw it. And what these data points were pointing toward was a coordinated effort to undermine me. I hired a lawyer, not because I had evidence yet, but because I wanted to be ready when I did. Her name was a person I had met at a Phoenix Women in Business event 2 years earlier. Sharp, direct, with a background in corporate litigation and a reputation for not losing. I told her what I was seeing. She listened without interrupting, which I had come to understand was how she worked. She collected everything first and assessed second. Document everything, she said. Every contact, every conversation, every date, and don't do anything that looks defensive. Don't preemptively call clients. Don't warn your contractors. Don't reach out to your brother. Let them move and watch where they move. That's hard, I said. I know, she said. But you want to be the person who let them come to you, not the person who was nervous. I went back to work. I kept documenting. 6 weeks later, it broke open. My brother had registered an LLC. I found this through a routine public records search that I had started running on my own name and company name after the pattern started emerging. The LLC was called Summit Advisory Partners. The registered agent was my father. The listed principals were my brother and someone I didn't recognize. A name I ran through LinkedIn and found was a former colleague of my father's from his time in commercial real estate. A man who had done some financial consulting work but had no specific background in compliance. They were building a competing firm, using my family name, my family connections, and, I was about to find out, my work. The contractor who had been approached came to me. She had declined the offer from my brother, partly because she was loyal and partly because, as she put it, the whole thing felt slimy. But before she declined, she had been sent a document, a business overview for Summit Advisory Partners, that included what appeared to be proprietary information, specifically a client development framework I had built internally and shared only with my team under a standard NDA. My contractor had screenshot everything before she responded. She handed me a folder. I sat in my office that evening after everyone had left and read through it. My framework. My language. My methodology, repackaged with different formatting and a new logo. I called my lawyer. I have it, I said. Bring it in, she said. All of it. What happened next took about 3 months to fully resolve, but I'll tell you the short version because the slow part, the legal mechanics, the back and forth, the deposition prep, wasn't where the important things happened. The important things happened in 2 conversations. The first was with my father. He called me on a Sunday morning, which told me they already knew something was coming. People like my father only call on Sunday mornings when they're trying to seem reasonable before things get formal. I think there's been a misunderstanding, he said. There hasn't. Your brother wasn't trying to steal anything. He was inspired by your model. That's different. He used my proprietary documentation, I said. That's not inspiration. That's misappropriation. You're going to destroy this family over paperwork. You tried to destroy my business over paperwork, I said. The only difference is that yours was stolen and mine is legal. He went quiet. In 30 years, I could count on one hand the number of times my father had gone quiet in a conversation. It was not a comfortable silence. We didn't think it would go this far, he finally said. I noticed he didn't say they hadn't done it. He said they hadn't thought it would go this far, which told me everything about how they had calculated the risk. They had assumed I would find out and back down, the way I had always backed down, the way I had learned to make peace with things that weren't fair, because fighting them cost too much. I need you to understand something, I said. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I built something real and someone tried to take it. Those aren't the same conversation. You're my daughter. I know that, I said. Call me when you're ready to talk about something else. I hung up. The second conversation was with my brother. This one happened not over the phone but in my lawyer's office, in the presence of both legal teams about 6 weeks into the formal proceedings. My brother had hired an attorney, someone my parents were paying for, I assumed, and there had been several rounds of letters and responses before we ended up in the same room. I had been prepared for him to be aggressive, dismissive, to minimize what had happened the way he had always minimized things that were inconvenient for him. Instead, he looked tired, which I hadn't expected. He looked like someone who had been told, for possibly the first time in his life, that there was a real consequence coming and that it was not going to be redirected or absorbed by someone else. His attorney made an opening statement. Mine responded. Numbers were discussed. The scope of potential damages. The question of whether the confidential information had been used to solicit any of my existing clients. It had. We had evidence of 2 outreach attempts, and what that meant for the breach of contract claim against the contractor NDA, which had been signed by my brother when he briefly, officially, worked as a part-time consultant from my company 18 months ago. 3 months. I had paid him fairly. He had signed all the standard paperwork because I had insisted on running things properly. He had forgotten about that paperwork, or assumed it didn't matter. It mattered. His attorney asked for a break. During the break, My brother looked across the table at me, not at his attorney, not at the wall, at me. "I didn't think you'd actually do this," he said. "I know," I said. "Mom and Dad are adults," I said. "Whatever happens to them in this is because of choices they made." "We're family," he said, and his voice had something in it that I hadn't heard in a very long time. Something that might have been genuine. "I know we are," I said. "That's not what this is about." We settled out of court. The terms are confidential, but I can tell you that Summit Advisory Partners was dissolved. The proprietary documentation was formally acknowledged as belonging to my company. There were financial damages paid. My father's name was removed from any filings going forward. My brother signed a non-compete. I won't tell you that I felt nothing when it was over. I felt quite a lot. I stood in the parking garage after the final meeting and sat in my car for maybe 20 minutes before I could drive. Not because I was sad exactly, but because there's a particular kind of grief that comes from being completely right about something you wished you were wrong about. I had known on some level for years that my family saw my success as a resource rather than an achievement. I had hoped I was being uncharitable. I wasn't. What I can tell you is what happened after. Ashford Financial renewed their contract and referred 2 colleagues. My contractor stayed. I promoted her. I hired a business development director, a woman with 15 years of industry experience, and we grew the client roster from 23 to 31 by the end of that year. My mother sent me a card at Christmas. I sent one back. "We are not close, but we are not nothing." I think that's where we will stay for a while, and I have made a certain peace with that. My brother moved to Seattle. I don't know much beyond that. My father called me on my birthday in April, which he had not done in 4 years. He didn't mention any of it. He asked about work. I told him it was going well. He said he was glad. I meant what I said to him on that Sunday morning. I didn't do it to punish anyone. I did it because the thing I had built was worth protecting, and because for the first time in my life I understood that protecting it wasn't a betrayal of my family. It was a refusal to let them make my success into something they could use. There's a difference between those two things. It took me 30 years to know it with the kind of certainty that holds up under pressure. Now I know. I used to think the hardest part of building something from nothing was the work. The early mornings, the spreadsheets I didn't fully understand yet, the clients who took 6 months to trust me enough to sign anything. I thought that was the hard part. I was wrong. The hard part was accepting that the people who should have been proud of me were instead waiting to see if they could benefit from it. My brother didn't steal from me because he was desperate. He wasn't. He had a roof over his head, parents who funded his lifestyle without asking questions, and more grace extended to him in 1 year than I had received in my entire adult life. He did it because it genuinely had not occurred to him that what I built was mine in a way that couldn't be renegotiated. That's not malice in the traditional sense. That's something quieter and in some ways harder to name. It's the assumption that your success exists inside a family system where everything is still theoretically communal, still up for redistribution, still subject to the approval of people who never invested a single dollar or hour into what you created. When I sat across from him in that conference room and he said he didn't think I'd actually go through with it, I believed him. He had watched me make peace with things my whole life. He had watched me accept the smaller portion, the lesser acknowledgement, that that's different, when I asked for the same resources he received without asking. He had years of data suggesting I would absorb this too. What he didn't have was the version of me that had spent 3 years learning exactly what I was worth and deciding, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, that I was done negotiating it downward. There's something I've come to understand about consequences. Real ones, not the kind people threaten and then walk back. Real consequences are not punishment. They are information. They tell the people around you what the actual cost of certain choices is, maybe for the first time. My father had never once encountered a version of me that had a lawyer, documentation, and the patience to wait until the moment was right. He had only known the version that wanted to keep the peace. Those are not the same person, and the gap between them is built not from anger, but from clarity. The business framework my brother used, the one I had spent 8 months developing, the one my contractor risked her own professional relationship to preserve and return to me, It came from something specific. It came from the hours I put in when nobody was watching, when nobody believed the company would make it past year one, when my father called it a gamble and I had to decide whether to agree with him or prove him wrong through the only method that actually works, which is showing up every single day until the numbers tell a different story. That's what intelligence actually is in my experience. Not a test score, not a quick read of a room. It's the willingness to stay with something long enough to understand it deeply, to build something real instead of borrowing what someone else built and calling it inspiration. And that's what I want to leave anyone with who has watched this and recognized something of their own story in it. The people who underestimate you are usually doing so because they've only ever seen you absorb things. They mistake your patience for your ceiling. It isn't. Your ceiling is somewhere they haven't looked yet because they stopped paying attention a long time ago. I sat in my car for 20 minutes after it was over, and then I drove back to my office because there was still work to do. There always is.